Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail, Part 8. The aircraft which had collided with mine was piloted by an army captain who was training for the Luftwaffe and his A2 license. He was loosely attached to our training cycle, but got much more solo flying than us and was allowed to be much more his own master. On this day, because flying conditions were ideal, the field was very busy. That in itself need not have been a problem, but it didn't leave much of a margin for error. In this case, the captain had mistaken two of the flags on the field for those of the takeoff line. He had been sitting in line with three other aircraft awaiting the signal to begin the takeoff run. When it came, he opened the throttle and began the run. However, probably because of the yawing of the aircraft as the tail lifted, he aligned himself with the wrong two flags. One was the small flag that marked the middle of the neutral zone, and the other was the last flag on the takeoff zone. The result was that he accelerated right through the neutral zone where I was, quite legitimately, maneuvering to get back to the takeoff line. I had been very lucky to survive the collision. The margin had been very slim indeed. The splintered wooden propeller of the captain's aircraft had sliced through my helmet just above my ear, barely breaking the skin. The rocker covers of one of the cylinders of the radial engine had caught my shoulder and broken one glass of my goggles, but nothing more. Just inches more and the collision would have been fatal. As it was, I was taken to Potsdam for X-ray and a checkup. The only injuries were the cut on my head and a sprain of one of the smaller bones in my hand. The army captain was not allowed to continue training at our field, and I suspect that it was his rank that had prevented more serious action being taken. That evening, as was tradition, the Zugführer threw a grand party with lots of Sekt, that is, German champagne. The party was a simple device to make you turn potential tragedy into triumph. It must have worked because, after all these years, I find it easier to recall the ebullience of the party than the terror of the accident. This was the case with much of the emotion we felt during those heady days. I have to search for the feeling of tragic loss for each of my friends who were killed or mutilated during the training, but the good times flood back easily. One of my most vivid memories was of a party when our team spirit really came to the fore. As platoons, we soon identified ourselves as being of one tribe or pack. Our individual Zugführerleutnants would be the pack leaders, and we soon felt close enough to them to hatch practical jokes. One time, under the leadership of Hans-Ulrich Rudel, we physically carried the small DKW car of the Zugführer of another platoon up the staircase to the officers' mess. There it was left, and, as the next day was Sunday, it fell to the junior cadets to bring it down again in full daylight. Besides flying, there were other activities which became more of a recreation, such as sailing. We were introduced to sailing in the Olympic Jolle and soon learned the rudiments of the art. Hinak Walle really had the edge on me as far as the sailing went. He had come from the north coast of Germany and was familiar with the crafts of the water, whereas I had had little time to study sailing, living at the top of the Schwäbische Alb. Apart from the fact that the sailing was an enjoyable part of our training, we could also develop it as a real recreation at the weekends. On the huge Havel Lake, southwest of Berlin, we hired sailing boats and spent many relaxing hours tacking up and down the Great Lake. To be sure of a sailing boat, we would book in advance, but if on the off chance we went without booking, we could always get canoes if there were no dinghies available. At the Potsdam end of the lake was a stretch of water known as the Zeppelinhafen. Here, there was a superb cafe and restaurant where we could take 5 o'clock tea, that was the name given to the afternoon, to early evening dance. Thus, we could enjoy an afternoon sailing on the lake and round it off with a few hours of dancing. I have very warm memories of those days. Other training was in driving right up to and including heavy goods vehicles. At that time, there was a special license for lorries, but the Luftwaffe insisted that we learn the proper technique, although we would probably rarely sit behind the wheel of a heavy lorry ever again. That was all rather mundane, though it did have its moments. More interesting by far was our introduction to motorcycles. Being young, the powerful motorcycles better suited our temperament. Again, we were to take a full course on the machine, and this included cross-country riding and some very hair-raising downhill slaloms. On the open road, the competitive spirit of youth would bubble up to the surface, and cadets would speed past the instructors only to come to grief on wet leaves on a corner, or more often simply run out of road. The net result was that we soon had a number of trainees in the hospital with broken legs and other injuries. The authorities quickly decided that we were all of a standard to qualify with a minimum of experience, and so we all got our motorcycle licenses quickly. Back at Werder, the training in the air was progressing with many accidents and incidents, one of which involved a friend of mine, an Austrian named Fischer. Every Thursday from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. there was Kasernenabendstunde, a kind of religious sermon which was given one week by the Catholic priest and the next by the Protestant pastor. Both of them came to us from the nearby garrison church at Potsdam. The first hour was a formal military-type service, but afterwards there was the opportunity to debate with the priests the many facets of religion as it affected their particular dogma. I was from a Protestant background and Fischer had been brought up as a Catholic, but we both shared the desire to quiz the priests on their convictions. One idea in particular was the cause of much heated argument with them, the subject of how best to behave to ensure that you went to heaven. Both of the priests received the same spirited attack from myself and Fischer, but it is fair to say that the Catholic seemed less able to accept our questions and to enter into free debate. He obviously disliked our apparent irreverence and more than hinted that our attitude, for instance, was a fairly sure way to eternal damnation rather than the bliss of heaven. I could accept that view, I suppose, but I wasn't prepared for the ruthless way in which he was later to try to drive the message home. The opportunity for the priest was offered by an accident, which is often the case. A clear, bright day offered good conditions to get many of the pupils into the air. I was on the ground as two aircraft began to approach the field. Naturally, our attention was taken by the sound of the motors and we turned our heads to watch the approach. To our horror, we could see that the two aircraft were on a collision course, one above the other. The pilot in the lower aircraft was concentrating on his approach and had not checked the 6 o'clock high position behind him. To be fair, it was a very unusual area for another aircraft to be, except of course under combat conditions. The pilot of the higher plane would have his 12 o'clock view obstructed by the engine and fuselage and to the sides by the lower main plane. The higher man was descending faster than the other and collision was inevitable. For a few seconds we were dumbstruck, not knowing what to do. Then Herr Harms ran out, firing red flares with his flare pistol. The pilot of the lower aircraft saw the warning and pulled back hard on the stick, not realizing that the danger was above him. There was a sickening impact as the propeller of the top plane smashed into the cockpit of the other aircraft. Inextricably tangled together, the two fell to the ground simultaneously. We raced across the grass in record time, myself in the lead, probably spurred on by the memory of my recent experience. As I ran, I wished, "Don't burn, don't burn." I was the first to arrive, my chest heaving from the effort and my mind racing. It was encouraging to see that the wreck didn't seem too bad, but when I looked into the damaged cockpit, I found myself looking into the open neck of my one-time debating friend Fischer. The slicing propeller had virtually decapitated him, exposing the ivory-white bones of the spine in stark contrast to the frothy red of the torn flesh and blood. The sight was like a hammer blow. I staggered back, I couldn't look anymore, but the vision was burned in my memory, as clear today as it was all those years ago. I was profoundly shocked by this experience, and thereafter I tried to avoid seeing the aftermath of accidents of all kinds. I couldn't stand the thought of repeating the horror of that day. Although the other pilot escaped virtually unharmed, there was no Sekt party that evening. The outcome of the inquiry was that it had been an accident. There had been no other way of warning Fischer of the danger from above, and without radio communications, we relied completely on visual signals, and these could be interpreted in different ways. In this case, Fischer had probably thought that something which he couldn't see was wrong and pulled up and away from where he thought the danger could be. However, even after the full military funeral of Fischer, the case was not closed for me. At the next Kasernenabendstunde, the Catholic priest decided that he would capitalize on the death of this atheist and preached powerfully about the fate of non-believers, stating clearly that there was little or no chance that the likes of Fischer could ever get to heaven. I couldn't believe what this man of God was saying. I shook with anger inside and slowly got to my feet. Without asking any formal permission, I started to leave the room. I was so choked with my contempt for the man that I hardly noticed that the rest of the trainees felt likewise. Outside the hall, I looked back and found to my surprise that the priest was alone and everyone had walked out on his so-called lesson. We took a vote and elected a speaker to represent our feelings to the officers, but nothing was done. Therefore, we had no choice but to take the law into our own hands. Risking court-martial for disobedience of orders, which is virtually unthinkable in the German military machine, we refused to enter the hall when this so-called holy man was present. After the second mutiny, he was replaced. As the years have passed, I have wondered if he and Fischer ever met again, and if so, where. When I look back to those very strictly military days, I'm amazed that I didn't get into more trouble. I've always been of a fairly strong nature and not afraid to voice my opinions. This, of course, is not desirable behavior within the inflexibilities of the military. Herr Harms was already a bag of nerves, and my appearance amongst his trainees did little or nothing to help his condition. Graf Perponcher became my principal mentor, although he didn't behave like most Prussian noblemen. However, he still liked to be addressed as Herr Graf. We seemed to get on very well. He had more faith in my ability than myself, however confident I seemed to be on the outside. Sometimes it seemed to me that he pushed us too far, too fast. I had progressed to aerobatics and found I could perform the maneuvers without undue distress. Climbing spirals, both left and right, spinning and spin recovery, and basics like bloops were all part of the program at this level. Again, we seemed to reach a watershed for some of my peers. The aerial aerobatics were too much for them. For days they tried to hang on in, but they were being airsick and feeling nauseous even hours after flights. They would lose weight and finally would have to come off the course. Most of them went to Luftwaffe anti-aircraft units. I felt very sorry for them, all of us having come so far. It was about here that Graf Perponcher decided that I would fly the Arado 66, an aircraft which I hadn't expected to meet for a while. It was a step to the B1 license which I would have to take, but I thought it was a bit of a leap forward for me. A couple of the top cadets in our platoon had already been in the Arado for a couple of days, but I hadn't expected to graduate yet. I'd had a few problems with the vertical climbing role, which is part of the Kunstflugschein K1, and had only just begun to master this when I was offered the chance to fly the Arado. Perponcher took me up in the Arado, did one circuit and landed. Then he handed over to me and pronounced that I was ready for my first B1 solo. I didn't share his confidence, but I was willing to try. It was a complete surprise, and I suddenly found that I was alone in the cockpit staring at a totally new control and instrument layout. Although I was nowhere near confident, I just couldn't say no. My gut feeling was that I wouldn't make it, but something, maybe my pride, wouldn't let me step away from this challenge. I was equally sure that this must be the epitaph of many young pilots. There I was, and there I was going to stay. I maneuvered the big biplane onto the takeoff line and then shouted to the fellow who was holding the flag, "Arndt! Arndt! Now that the big fellow has got out, how do I change the trim to be a little more forward? Is there a handle or a lever or something?" He only just heard me over the steady thumbs of the 240 horsepower engine. He thought for a moment, then, cupping his hands around his mouth, he shouted back, "A small round button to your left! Push it forwards a little!" I gave him the thumbs up and made the adjustment. Then, hard in my mouth, I looked up to see Arndt drop the takeoff flag, and I pushed the throttle fully forward, full power. Quickly I gathered speed with the big aircraft bumping majestically over the grass and gradually lifting off. I felt like a real king to be able to complete this exercise without mishap. Ahead of me lay the lake, which was in the direction of takeoff that day, but I was still too full of my success to worry about anything going wrong. That is exactly the time things go wrong, of course, when you least expect it. At 150 meters and still climbing, I had eased the throttle back a little, but suddenly the big 8-cylinder motor started to sputter and cough. Then it quit. I went from the exhilaration of my success and the roar of the engine to the lonely isolation of the cockpit, with the only noise being the wind shrieking through the wires and over the surfaces. Oh boy, I thought to myself. My first B1 solo, and I've got a real emergency to cope with. The training took over and the instructor's voice started to bark from my memory. Look for a good field, select one, and then stay with this decision, even if things turn out worse later. I estimated that I would make it across the lake and I could see a good-sized field close to the shoreline. I brought her around on a suitable glide path and made my approach. All was going well until I saw a power line strung across my approach. I had to bring the nose up a fraction to hold height and managed to clear the lines, but I had now encroached on the available landing ground. I had to lose altitude and get her down soon or I'd be out of field. Side-slipping in a strange aircraft wasn't easy, but with a little rough treatment of the stick, I got her down and we came to a halt in about 100 meters, nearly standing the aircraft on its nose. The ground was very soft and the wheels had almost sunk in. I'd been lucky. I was very proud of my flying, first time out in the Arado, and I pulled off a successful emergency landing. Unstrapping myself, I hopped out of the cockpit and made off to find a telephone. This was our next instruction. Get to a telephone, let us know where you are, and give us some idea of what went wrong. Damn! In my welter of self-congratulation, I had forgotten to look over the plane and see if I could determine why the engine had failed. Still, I'd only been walking for 5 minutes or so and I quickly backtracked to have a look at the Arado. I climbed back into the cockpit and switched on the ignition. All of the instruments jumped into life and I began to see what story they told. It didn't take long. Fuel pressure was 0. I took a look down to the left where I had altered the trim and found that there were 2 round buttons. A black one marked Trimming, Forward and Aft, and a red one marked Fuel, Close and Open. Very smart indeed. Before takeoff, I had closed the fuel supply. My great self-esteem and pride at handling the landing so well drained out of me into a wet, marshy ground. I pushed the red button back to the on position and self-consciously made my way to a farmhouse to telephone. This time I didn't hurry. I wasn't looking forward to making this specific call. I couldn't own up to my fault on the telephone, so I just said that I lost fuel pressure. I was congratulated on my successful landing and told to return to the aircraft. A truck was already on its way with some fuel, a mechanic, and so on. Other aircraft in the circuit had seen mine and reported the location. Also, 2 instructors were going to fly a Stieglitz and landed close to the Arado. I dawdled back with little enthusiasm for the next few hours. I knew that no mechanical fault would be found on the plane and then I'd have to tell them what I had done. I really felt foolish. When I got back, the Stieglitz was already neatly parked near to the Arado. The instructors had checked the instruments and controls over and had nothing but praise for my landing. But they were mystified as to why the engine had cut out. All indication was that there wasn't a fault. I couldn't lie to them, so I just told the truth and waited for the bawling out, which I felt would follow. But it never came. They didn't seem to mind too much. It had been an accident and no real damage had been done, apart from my pride, of course. When the truck arrived, we all got together under the wings around the fuselage to lift the heavy Arado out of the mud. This done, one of the instructors started her up and backtracked to the edge of the field. When he was sure that all was running well, he decided to taxi the length of the field to check that he could reach flying speed okay before taking off. But things must have gone better than he thought, and he simply gave the Arado a boost of throttle and she rose out of the field and cleared the hedges with ease. The Stieglitz wasn't so heavy and posed no problems. In a few moments it was airborne, following the Arado back to base. I had the ignominious reward of a ride back in the back of the truck with the mechanics and other personnel. But that was after the farmer had given us a first-class lunch. He thought it was quite the most thrilling thing to happen on his farm for years. Although my emergency landing had been of my own making, it was still an excellent piece of flying for a cadet, although I could never really congratulate myself, having caused the problem in the first place. Other accidents were avoided by sheer dint of good flying by pupils. A case in point was Martin Lensch. He was at a more advanced stage of training, already up to his B2 and flying the low-wing monoplane, the Junkers W-34. Again, we were on the ground and saw him take off, but all was not well. Whilst bumping over the rough grass, one of the undercarriage legs had come loose and was hanging down. There was no radio, and so we had to rely on crude signals and hope that he would read the right message. After a 5-minute circuit, Martin came back to the field for a landing and saw the red flare signals which were fired up close to him. He retracted the flaps and made a low pass to see if he could get a clue as to what was wrong. We held up a round plate about 1 meter in diameter to indicate wheel, and he indicated that he understood by waggling his wings as he climbed away for another circuit. By the time he returned, we had another board with R to indicate right, and again he apparently read it correctly, waggling his confirmation. On the next circuit, he had slowed and was making a landing approach. We held our breath as he flew close to the ground with the right wing held high. It was a practice run. Then, around he came again, this time very close to the stall speed of the Junkers. Right wing still held up, He managed to get the left wheel down and slowed the aircraft so well that, at last, when the right wing came down, there was no damage at all. He was carried shoulder high from the plane and not without due cause, for the same aircraft was up in the air the very next day. Such had been Martin's skill. That evening there was a huge party with many bottles of Sekt. More Sekt for Ulrich, and with this, welcome to the After Action Report. Lots of things to talk about in this episode, and the culinary aspects come first, of course. This time it's Sekt. Now, Sekt is German sparkling wine, which is a fizzy beverage created by either adding yeast and sugar after fermentation or simply by injecting some CO2. You all know champagne, which is basically the same thing, it just comes from the eponymous region in France. Sekt in Germany is generally served during festive occasions and consumed in huge quantities, guaranteeing a headache. On another note, I laughed out loud while reading this chapter because the practical jokes that happen in the armed forces apparently have always been the same. Because I too partook in the ritual of carrying the cars or motorcycles of our instructors to various places, with them searching for their transports for hours. Good fun, I can tell you that. We are also, again, reminded that aviation is dangerous. The accident where Fischer is killed is something that every pilot dreads. It is eerily similar to the Wings over Dallas mid-air collision from 2022, where a P-63 and a B-17 collided due to bad briefings and a plethora of other factors. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this incident. The pilot of the P-63 did not see the massive B-17 because it was obscured by the nose of his own aircraft. Now, imagine how easy it is in the situation described in the book to overlook a rather small single-seat trainer. In either case, a very tragic accident was the result. Same goes for Ulrich's own emergency landing after his engine quit. As it turns out, it was a case of unfamiliarity with aircraft as well as an apparently bad cockpit layout. In any case, Ulrich is fine and will continue training, which we will learn more about in the next episode. Until then, cheers and bye-bye.